So I guess it all started about a year ago, maybe a little longer. It's weird, you know? I thought Giselle and I had a good thing going. We weren't the perfect couple. Who is? But things felt solid. We've been married for almost 7 years now, and she's always been steady, even predictable. But then I started seeing these little shifts like bits of sand slipping out from under my feet. And at first, I brushed them off. Figured, maybe she's going through some self-care phase or something. I didn't want to be the overbearing husband, questioning every move. But looking back, maybe I should have listened to my gut a lot sooner. The first thing was her routine. Giselle used to be so predictable that I could almost set my watch to her day. She'd go to the gym in the mornings, spend her afternoons running errands or catching up with friends. Then we'd have dinner together. But suddenly she was leaving earlier, coming home later. Said she needed more time to herself. I thought, fine, whatever. We all need our space. But it wasn't just once or twice. This became her new normal. She'd be out the door before I'd even finish my first coffee. And half the time, she wouldn't be back until I'd already eaten dinner. One night, she came home with a shopping bag, a high-end jewelry bag. Mind you, I remember joking, you get a raise at work or something. She just laughed, said she was treating herself. Now, this is where I started raising an eyebrow. Giselle, the same woman who'd clip coupons and wait for sales, suddenly treating herself to designer handbags, perfumes, and apparently jewelry. Something wasn't adding up. I tried to play it off, but it sat heavy in my gut. I kept thinking, who is this woman who's coming home with luxury bags and bags of new clothes? I never seen her drop cash like that on herself. Not once in all the years I'd known her. Even my sister, Melissa, noticed the changes. She'd pop by for dinner or a quick catch-up, and it was like she couldn't resist eyeing Giselle every time she pulled out some new shiny accessory. At one point, Melissa even pulled me aside and asked, Clarence, what's up with Giselle? She's different. I didn't have a good answer for her. I mean, what was I supposed to say? That my wife suddenly acted like she had a secret life? But yeah, it got me thinking harder. I started seeing things I brushed off before. Then there was Alice, our neighbor. Now Alice is a little nosy, not gonna lie, but I'm grateful for it now. She'd mentioned, all casual, that she'd seen Giselle at this cafe or that restaurant with that guy. She didn't say much more than that. Just threw it out there like a hint. A guy, Giselle, and some guy. I played it off with Alice. Didn't want to jump to conclusions, but my mind was racing. I couldn't get it out of my head. What the hell was Giselle doing with another man? That was when I started paying real attention. One night, after she fell asleep, I went through our joint account statements. And there it was plain as day. Charges for massages, spa services, fancy lunches, all in places she'd never mentioned to me. She didn't even like massages. I couldn't believe what I was looking at. It was like seeing my life, my marriage right there in numbers, and I didn't recognize any of it. I'd find myself lying in bed, looking over at her while she slept, wondering if I was imagining things, if I was the one going nuts. Was she just blowing off steam? Was she bored? Or was there something more? I started to feel like I was unraveling. I imagined all these scenarios, some of them stupidly innocent, like she just made new friends or was splurging because she finally wanted to change. But then my mind would drift into the ugly stuff. Was she hiding something from me? Some secret life I wasn't a part of? And the worst part, I couldn't bring myself to ask her straight up. I mean, will you even say, hey, Giselle, are you cheating on me? That sounds insane, right? And a part of me didn't want to believe it was even possible. After a few days of biting my tongue, I finally asked her about these massages. I mean, maybe I was jumping to conclusions, but I had to know. So I casually brought it up one evening when she got back. I asked, hey, you've been spending a lot of time at these massage places. Must be relaxing. I try to keep it light, but damn if she didn't go stiff as a board just for a second before forcing that fake too bright smile. She brushed it off with some line about how it's just relaxation and that it wasn't worth discussing. Not worth discussing? That rubbed me the wrong way. Since when was she so secretive about something as simple as a massage? In her tone, it wasn't just evasive. It was like she was daring me to keep pushing. So I let it drop for the moment, but my suspicions were spiraling. I was done giving her the benefit of the doubt. The next day, I was still seething when I ran into Oliver. Now Oliver's a solid guy, a mutual friend who happens to work at a bank. I don't know what got into me, but after a few beers, I spilled the whole thing. The new spending, the unexplained outings, her weird defensiveness. Oliver listened without interrupting, just nodding with that serious look on his face. When I mentioned the joint account transactions, his eyes narrowed, and he offered to look into it. Nothing crazy, he said. Just I'll see if I can spot anything that seems off. A few days later, he called me up. When I heard his voice, I knew right away that he'd found something. There were payments listed under massage services, but they were linked to some sketchy accounts I didn't recognize. Stuff that didn't add up as legit, let alone regular massages. Oliver didn't say much. He just sent me the information and told me to stay sharp. Around that same time, I got talking to a new guy at work, Evan. It's funny how these things happen. He mentioned in passing that he'd been through a rough patch with his wife. I asked and he shared more. He told me she'd been seeing someone on the side, how he'd been blindsided but eventually pieced it together. And then he looked me dead in the eye and said, man, if you're having doubts, don't ignore him. Sometimes you gotta call in the pros. That's when it hit me. I couldn't just sit back and keep guessing. I needed to know. I was tired of this pit of dread in my stomach of constantly second-guessing myself. So a couple of days later, I met up with a guy named Brady, a private investigator Evan had recommended. Brady was all business, calm and collected, no questions asked. I laid it out for him. The bank statements, the weird charges, the way she'd become practically a stranger. He took it all in nodding, making notes. I'll be discreet, he said, but I'll get you answers. What followed was one of the longest, most excruciating weeks of my life. Every time she left the house, every time my phone buzzed, I felt this electric anticipation mixed with dread. I didn't know what I wanted more, to be right or to be wrong. Then came the call from Brady. He had something for me, he said. I met him in a dingy little cafe, trying to keep my hands from shaking as he slid over an envelope. Inside were photos, a whole stack of them, each one a stab to the gut. There she was, Giselle, my wife, sitting across from some guy, her hand resting on his arm. Their heads were close, too close. She was smiling, laughing even, a look I hadn't seen on her face in months. It wasn't just friendly, it was intimate. And then the kicker, there was a video. Brady handed me a USB drive, not meeting my eyes. This one you might want to sit down for, he said. When I watched it later that night, it was like my worst nightmares had come to life. There she was arm in arm with this guy, Tristan, apparently the masseur. They were walking into a hotel together, like it was the most normal thing in the world. I didn't need to see the rest. I knew what came next, and that was enough. I sat there, the world tilting around me. Everything felt surreal, like I was watching someone else's life blow up. My fists clenched, my whole body tense with anger, betrayal, and hurt all at once. I couldn't believe how thoroughly she lied to me. The casual ease with which she deceived me. All those late nights, the expensive gifts, the me time, it had all been for him. I was furious, but more than that, I was wounded in a way I'd never experienced. Memories of our happy moments started flashing through my mind, but now they felt hollow, cheap. I couldn't shake the image of her with him. It was like a knife twisting in my gut, but that hurt turned cold like ice. That night, I dug through every old photo I could find of us. Trips we took together, holidays, birthdays. It was like I was watching a movie of someone else's life, some stranger who'd been stupid enough to trust. I couldn't reconcile that woman in the pictures with the one sneaking off to hotels with another man. But as I sat there, bitterness pooling in my stomach, and ideas started to take shape. I wasn't going to let this slide. She'd taken something from me, my trust, my loyalty, my love, and turned it into a joke. And that I couldn't forgive. I had to admit, the idea of revenge was a bit new for me. I wasn't usually the scheming type, but after watching her walk into that hotel with Tristan, it felt like the only way I'd ever get a shred of peace again. Giselle had turned me into some gullible fool. And every time I thought about it, that bitterness hardened into something darker. I knew exactly when to do it too. Our anniversary. After all, she made a joke out of our marriage. Why not make it official? I kept my distance from her the next few days, keeping my tone neutral, acting like nothing was wrong. She seemed pleased, probably thinking she'd pulled one over on me. Meanwhile, I was busy behind the scenes collecting every piece of evidence I had on her affair. Every photo, every bank statement, every receipt for those massages and gifts. I was going to make sure she couldn't worm her way out of this when the moment came. Then came the next step, telling people I trusted just enough to cover my bases. My brother Chris was the first person I went to. He'd always been wary of Giselle, and the minute I mentioned the affair, he wasn't surprised. He just looked at me with this mix of pity and anger, like he'd been waiting for the other shoe to drop. "Don't hold back," he told me. "She's made a fool out of you, man. Do what you have to." Chris didn't sugarcoat things, and for once I appreciated it. He was all in, ready to support whatever I had planned. I also reached out to Sylvia, one of Giselle's close friends. I couldn't believe I was telling someone from her side of things, but Sylvia had always been honest, even a bit blunt. I told her what I knew, leaving out the revenge part, of course, and just hinted that Giselle might have been hiding something. She was shocked, but I could tell she suspected something too. She's not who you think she is," Sylvia said slowly, almost like she was talking to herself. With that, I knew she'd be an ally if I needed one. Then there was Molly. We'd known each other since college, and we'd kept in touch over the years. Mostly just friends, but with a few hints of something more, something neither of us had ever acted on. I reached out to her, told her everything. I didn't even know what I expected, but I just needed someone else on my side. To my surprise, she was not only supportive but willing to help. "Let me be there for you," she said, and her voice had this warmth that I hadn't felt in a long time. That's when the plan took a different shape. She agreed to meet me at a cabin I rented, far enough from home that we wouldn't run in anyone we knew. The anniversary rolled around, and I kept up the charade. I suggested a little nature retreat, a romantic getaway to celebrate. She looked surprised but pleased, clearly thinking she'd put me under some spell of ignorance. I gritted my teeth through the drive out there, all the while reminding myself that she'd broken every vow she'd ever made to me. It was time for her to face the fallout. That night, we had dinner, just the two of us in the cabin, and for a moment, it felt almost normal, like we were that couple again from the early years. But as she poured herself wine and talked about our future, I couldn't keep quiet. I threw out a few casual questions, each one with an edge, watching her carefully. I asked her how work was going, asked about her relaxation days, each one landing like a jab. She laughed it off at first, but I could see the shift, the way her hand tightened on her glass, the look that flickered in her eyes. It was like she knew something was coming, but couldn't quite place it. Finally, I excused myself, stepping out just long enough for Molly to slip into the cabin. I gave her the signal, and she made herself comfortable in the back room. Then I waited, giving Giselle just enough time to let her guard down to feel safe. When I returned, Giselle tried to act like nothing was wrong, but I could see the tension. "You look distant," she finally said, a hint of irritation in her voice. That was it. I didn't respond. I just got up, letting her sit there with that look of confusion as I headed toward the back room. Molly was waiting, and we sat close just as planned. Enough for Giselle to get a clear view when she inevitably followed. I barely had to wait. Within moments, Giselle stormed in, her face twisted in a mixture of rage and shock. "What the hell is going on?" She practically spat, her voice shrill and demanding. I'd expected her to be angry, but seeing her there, that smug expression wiped off her face, was satisfying in a way I hadn't anticipated. "What's going on?" I said calmly, letting each word sink in. "Oh, I think you know exactly what's going on. You want to talk about betrayals? Let's talk about yours first." I held up the stack of photos, the bank statements, the video, everything I collected. "Recognize any of this?" She went pale, her mouth opening and closing as she tried to come up with some excuse, but the words wouldn't come. She tried to stammer something about stress and needing comfort, but I cut her off. Comfort? That's funny, because I thought that's what marriage was supposed to be about. But clearly I was wrong. I watched her crumble right there, her face crumbling as she went from angry to desperate. She tried to justify herself, saying it wasn't serious and she was lonely, but it all sounded so hollow. The excuses were weak, just like her loyalty. I let her ramble, watching as she fell apart in front of me. When she finally ran out of excuses, I just looked at her, shaking my head. "You threw it all away, Giselle. Every bit of trust, every damn thing we built. I hope he was worth it." With that, I turned and walked out of the cabin with Molly, leaving Giselle there, surrounded by the ruins of her lives. As I got in the car, I felt a strange sense of calm, a quiet certainty that no matter what came next, I'd finally taken back some control. I didn't look back, didn't wait to see what she'd do. The day after the cabin scene, Giselle's desperation was almost palpable even through the phone. Call after call, voicemail after voicemail. She wouldn't stop. I watched the screen light up with her name, each ring a reminder of her betrayal. At first, I ignored it all. I wanted her to feel the weight of what she'd done. Let her stew in the mess she'd made. But after hours of constant calls, I decided to see her. I wanted to watch her squirm. I wasn't going there for sympathy or closure. I was going to watch her lie to my face. When I walked into the cafe, she was already there, sitting at the corner table, eyes red and makeup smudged like she hadn't slept. She looked up hopeful for a moment, and I kept my face as blank as possible, giving her no satisfaction. I just nodded and sat across from her, waiting. Let her start. I wasn't about to make it easy. "Clarence, please," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know I've made mistakes." "Mistakes," I repeated slowly, leaning back in my chair. Interesting choice of words. She flinched but pressed on. She launched into some half-baked explanation. Something about feeling lost and needing comfort. She said it as if it justified what she'd done, like it somehow excused months of lying to my face. I kept my eyes locked on hers, making sure she saw the disgust on my face as she tried to spin her story. I didn't say a word, didn't react, just let her flounder. "It wasn't serious," she whispered, her voice wavering. "Tristan was just a distraction, a distraction." I echoed, my voice, "I see. Funny, I thought marriage was supposed to be more than that. But hey, if distractions are your thing, I hope it was worth it." She didn't like that. I watched her shift, her gaze turning defensive. "Clarence, you haven't exactly been here either. You've been so busy with work. You're always at the office, always focused on everything but me." "Focused on work?" I couldn't help but laugh, a cold, humorless sound that even surprised me. Is that supposed to be my fault? All those late nights, the hours I put in, all of that was to build a life for us, for our future. But that wasn't enough for you, was it? She looked down, biting her lip, but I wasn't done. I listed everything, the sacrifices, the compromises, the countless times I'd put her needs ahead of mine. She squirmed, clearly uncomfortable, and I wasn't about to make it easier. "You want more attention? Try being a wife first. You didn't need a distraction. You wanted out." She was quiet then, her face twisted in a mix of guilt and anger. I could tell she wasn't used to me calling her out like this. Wasn't used to being the one on the receiving end. And for once, I was glad. For once, she had to feel the consequences of her actions. She brought up Derek, a close friend who'd always been on her side. "You should talk to Derek," she said, almost pleading. "He knows. He understands." I wanted to laugh again. Derek, the guy who'd always told me to ease up on her. The one who thought Giselle could do no wrong. Fine. If she wanted me to talk to him, I'd do it. So I did. A few days later, I met up with Derek, told him everything. The affair, the cabin confrontation, the financial lies, the months of deceit. He sat there shocked, and I saw that flicker of pity in his eyes. He knew then that she was beyond saving, that I had every right to be as furious as I was. His expression shifted from disbelief to something closer to shame, and he started pulling away from her. Even her closest friend was beginning to see her for who she really was. With Derek out of the way, I turned my focus back to the legal side of things. I'd hired Margaret, a lawyer who came highly recommended. She wasn't one for small talk. Her approach was pure business, which I appreciated. I laid it all out for her. Every twisted detail, every receipt, every bit of betrayal. She was calm, nodding as she made notes. And when I finished, she just looked up at me with a slight smile. "You got a strong case," she said simply, her tone reassuring. "She's betrayed not only your trust, but also your finances. We can use that." Margaret encouraged me to document everything, and I mean everything. From the joint account transfers to the hidden charges, she wanted a record of every penny Giselle had misused. It was therapeutic in a way, going through it all knowing that this would come back to bite her in court. Then there was Olivia, one of Giselle's old acquaintances. I never expected her to take my side, but once she heard about the affair, her attitude shifted. She was well connected, knew practically everyone in our social circle, and she had her own way of spreading news. Giselle was subtly cut off, isolated from gatherings, events, even casual brunches she'd once been the center of. Olivia never outright told anyone, but word spread, and Giselle's friends started distancing themselves. It was satisfying to watch, knowing that her lies were catching up to her in more ways than one. Finally, the day came when I filed for divorce. I thought Giselle had seen it coming, but when her lawyer served her the papers, she looked blindsided, like it had just hit her that this was real, that she was actually going to face consequences. I made it clear through Margaret that I wasn't going easy. This wasn't going to be some amicable split where she walked away with half of what I'd worked for. Margaret was relentless, tearing through every legal loophole to ensure I keep what was mine, that I'd retain the house, the savings, and most of the assets. Giselle had betrayed our marriage and, by extension, my hard-earned finances. I wasn't about to let her profit from it. Margaret also advised me to keep digging into our expenses. So I went back even further, combing through years of joint accounts, receipts, anything that might help. What I found only made me angrier. She'd been using our money for lavish dinners, designer clothes, weekend getaways. All things she told me were for her own self-care. I could only imagine how much she'd spent on Tristan, the gifts and trips she'd hidden under vague labels. Seeing it all laid out, the sheer scale of her betrayal brought it all home for me. This wasn't just infidelity. It was financial abuse. She'd lied, cheated, and robbed me blind. Every receipt became another nail in her case, another piece of ammunition for court. And that's when I knew I'd have my day in court, and when it was over, she'd get exactly what she deserved. She wanted to play games with my life, my trust, my money. Well, now it was my turn to take control. The social fallout from Giselle's betrayal was swift and merciless. News of her affairs spread like wildfire, fueled by Olivia's strategic gossiping, and the ripple effects were staggering. Friends who had once showered her with affection began to distance themselves, whispering behind closed doors about the woman who had broken their trust. It was a dizzying spectacle of social decline, and I couldn't help but watch with a grim satisfaction. She had traded in our marriage for a fling, and now the world was doing the same to her. I caught glimpses of Giselle at events I had once attended with her. Those casual brunches that had been filled with laughter now felt like battlegrounds where her former friends were careful to avoid her gaze. I could see the hurt in her eyes, the way she desperately tried to engage people who were no longer interested in her company. It was as if the more she reached out, the more they pulled away, leaving her isolated and alone. I found myself almost reveling in it, the discomfort on her face feeding a quiet part of me that had been wounded for so long. But while Giselle's world crumbled around her, I began to find my footing again. Tristan, on the other hand, was quick to abandon her as the financial reality of her situation began to dawn on her. With the divorce proceedings underway and Giselle's money dwindling, he started avoiding her calls, finding wealthier clients who could give him what he really wanted: money. It was poetic justice, watching her try to reach out to the man for whom she had risked everything, only to be met with silence. The realization must have been gut-wrenching for her, recognizing that the man she had chosen over our marriage had only been interested in her for what she could provide. The tables had turned, and she was left with nothing but the remnants of her poor choices. Meanwhile, I was buoyed by the support of my friends and family. They rallied around me, appalled by Giselle's actions, and I began to feel something I hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Ben and Erica, an older couple who had been friends with us since the beginning, reached out. They invited me to their home for dinners and gatherings, creating a safe space where I could share my experiences without judgment. Their kindness was a balm to my wounded pride. They introduced me to new faces, new perspectives, and slowly, I began to emerge from the shell I had retreated into. At one of those gatherings, I met Stacy, one of Olivia's friends. She was fresh from her own breakup, and we bonded over our shared experiences of betrayal and heartache. There was an unexpected camaraderie in our conversations, a deep understanding of each other's struggles. Stacy was genuine and easy to talk to, and it felt good to connect with someone who understood the pain of being deceived. As we spent time together, Our friendship began to blossom. And for the first time since everything went down, I felt a flicker of excitement about the future. As the divorce proceedings continued, I was buoyed by a series of financial victories in court. Margaret was relentless, dismantling Giselle's arguments piece by piece, using the evidence I had painstakingly collected to secure a favorable outcome. I retained the house, kept my assets, and most importantly, maintained my dignity throughout the process. Watching Margaret go to work was exhilarating, her confidence spilling into my own sense of empowerment. Giselle's dreams of a lucrative settlement crumbled under the weight of her own deceit. And with each ruling in my favor, I felt a sense of justice taking hold. But as the dust settled, I found myself grappling with an unexpected emptiness. I had won, hadn't I? I had taken back control, had defended my honor, and secured my future. Yet I felt strangely hollow. Watching Giselle's downfall wasn't the triumph I had envisioned. It left a bitter taste in my mouth. I had fought hard for everything I had, but in the process, I'd also lost something profoundly important. My marriage, my trust in others, and ultimately a part of myself. It was during this period of reflection that I realized I needed to reconnect with the world outside the pain. I reached out to my friends, exploring new hobbies, diving into projects I had neglected while wrapped up in the turmoil of my marriage. I even started exercising again, rediscovering the joy of pushing my limits, feeling the endorphins kick in as I ran or lifted weights. Slowly, I began to reclaim parts of my identity that I buried under years of complacency. Despite the emotional roller coaster, I was learning to look ahead rather than dwell in the shadows of the past. With Stacy's support and the encouragement of my friends, I was ready to embrace whatever came next. It wasn't just about moving on. It was about rebuilding, reconstructing a life that was wholly mine, free from the shackles of betrayal. I found a sense of peace in the chaos, realizing that while Giselle had chosen to destroy our marriage, I had the power to rebuild my future on my own terms. I was ready to step into the light, leaving behind the darkness of deception. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was finally moving forward. With the divorce finalized, I felt a strange mixture of relief and anticipation. It was time to fully embrace my new life, to shake off the shadows of my past, and step into a future that felt wide open. I knew I had a long way to go, but for the first time in ages, I felt hopeful. I started with small changes, things that would allow me to reconnect with myself. I took up hobbies I had pushed aside during my marriage. Guitar lessons, cooking classes, and even a weekend woodworking workshop. Each new experience felt like a step toward reclaiming parts of me that Giselle had stifled. I even booked a trip I dreamed about for years. A solo adventure to the national parks I'd always wanted to explore. The thought of hiking through breathtaking landscapes, immersing myself in nature felt liberating. I was finally doing something for myself, something I wanted. Stacy became a significant part of this journey. Our friendship had blossomed from shared experiences into something deeper, marked by mutual respect and understanding. She encouraged me to step outside my comfort zone, pushing me to try new things. We started going on hikes together, exploring trails that revealed stunning vistas and hidden gems. I remember one hike in particular where we reached the summit just as the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. Standing there, I felt a rush of gratitude for my life, for the beauty I had overlooked for so long. We also took our classes together, painting, pottery, even a cooking class where we fumbled our way through unfamiliar recipes, laughing at our mistakes. Those evenings spent creating something tangible together were therapeutic, a reminder of the joy in simple things. Slowly, our connection deepened, and it wasn't long before I found myself falling for her. It felt different this time. No games, no deceit. Just two people who understood each other's struggles and supported one another wholeheartedly. Then out of the blue, I received a message from Giselle. It had been months since we'd seen or spoken to each other. She reached out seeking closure, her words laced with a tone of desperation. She was living in a modest apartment, working a low-paying job, facing the harsh reality of the choices she had made. Her message was an apology, an attempt to explain herself and to find some way back into my life. I read her words, feeling a mix of emotions that I hadn't expected. Part of me wanted to lash out, to remind her of everything she had done, but I took a breath and decided to respond with the grace I had cultivated over these past few months. I offered her polite closure, explaining that I had moved on and found happiness again. I wished her well, but made it clear that I had no intention of rekindling anything. It felt good to stand firm, to own my decisions without anger or bitterness clouding my judgment. As summer approached, I decided it was time to celebrate my new beginning. I organized a gathering at my house, inviting all the people who had supported me throughout this ordeal. Margaret, Olivia, Ben, Erica, and of course Stacy. I wanted to express my gratitude for their unwavering support for helping me navigate the storm. The evening was filled with laughter and warmth, the kind of atmosphere I hadn't felt in years. I shared my journey, how I had rebuilt my life piece by piece, and thanked each person for being there when I needed them the most. It was a cathartic experience, a chance to publicly acknowledge the love and friendship that had carried me through the darkest days. And then I took a deep breath, my heart racing slightly as I introduced Stacy as my partner. The room erupted in cheers, and as we raised our glasses to toast to new beginnings, I felt a profound sense of peace wash over me. This was it. This was the life I had been searching for. Looking around the room, I saw faces that had witnessed my journey. I felt lighter knowing that I was no longer defined by the betrayal I had endured. I was stronger, wiser, and ready for whatever came next. The darkness had receded, replaced by the vibrant colors of my new life. In the weeks that followed, I immersed myself in my passions, traveling, exploring, deepening my relationship with Stacy. I felt the weight of the past lift more and more each day. I was no longer a victim. I was a survivor, someone who had taken the ashes of a broken marriage and transformed them into something beautiful. As I reflected on how far I'd come, I marveled at the journey I had undertaken. It hadn't been easy, but each step had led me to this moment, one filled with hope, joy, and a renewed sense of self. I looked forward to the future with excitement, ready to embrace whatever adventures awaited me. The past was a chapter closed, and ahead of me lay a bright new story, one I was eager to write on my own terms.